Thank you. Thank you all for coming, especially on this day. I think we might have a few people still straggling in because I understand the traffic is very bad, and of course we had this nearby earthquake and some of the schools were let out and everything else. So I think some of the people that were intending to come here tonight may have changed their plans. So I was thinking of taking another few minutes, but I think in the interest of everybody's schedule, we'll get going right away. I'm very happy to welcome our guest speaker, Emre Gençer, who's a research scientist at the MIT Energy Initiative. It's an organization I'm very familiar with. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
And I'm a colleague of Dr. Professor Ernie Moniz, who I think founded the MIT Energy Initiative and is still closely associated with it. So it's kind of like a family reunion to have Emre Bey here. And also our wonderful guest speakers, Budak Dilli, who I met for the first time. He's a former director of Energy Affairs at the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources. We're very happy to have him. And our sister organization, Shura, the director of that is Değer Saygın, and we're very happy to have him. A lot of people ask us about, well, there's ICAC and Shura, and we're both very closely working with each other, and both are trying to advance energy policy in slightly different ways. So this talk this evening, I think, is going to reveal some interesting insights that maybe a lot of you haven't heard before. And we really focus on some of the realism of what's needed for the energy transition. I think it's going to be a sobering talk, a very interesting talk. And without any further delay, Emre Bey, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor Di Figlio, for the introduction and also for the invitation. I'm really excited to share what we are doing at MIT Energy Initiative on the energy transition, and I'm really happy that you can join us today. So first of all, I would like to give you an outline of what I will be talking about. So there are many subjects, and I will touch upon many vignettes on these topics, but I will start with about what is energy transition and how we see it, and what are the challenges that we need to address, and especially in terms of looking from a systems approach. So it is the conventional ways of looking at some of the outlooks. It's changing, and I want to share with you what's our approach and how we are looking at the energy transition topic. And then I will give you an example from environmental impact of renewable powers. So I will touch upon different subjects. One is life cycle emissions on renewable power. So it's really hard to claim that any energy source is zero emission, although they are significantly lower than the fossil resources. And then I will give you an example about the operational change of existing natural gas fleet from California and how this is impacting the overall emissions of the system. Then I will move on to the carbon capture issue. So I really believe that the carbon capture is part of the solution, and I will give you some examples of what is the current status, where we are, and where should have been so far. And I will also show you some examples from the power sectors, how far we are from actually deploying carbon capture at scale. And then for the last part of the talk, I will touch upon the hydrogen issue. So we need to use another energy vector for deep decarbonization, and hydrogen is one of the candidates for this. And I will give you an example and also some of the thoughts that we are currently investigating. So without further ado, I will start with the general definition of energy transition. So there are mainly two components of energy transition. One is growing demand. So especially in developing world, the energy demand will be growing. So the GDP per capita will increase, and so the energy needs will increase. But the problem is we need to meet this demand while we are significantly reducing carbon emissions. So this is a very challenging issue. So we know how to produce electricity, we know how to produce energy for transportation, but we don't necessarily know how we can do it without emissions or significantly reducing emissions. So there are many outlooks looking into this problem. So, some are more optimistic than others, but it's a challenging problem. That's why everybody is working on this subject. All the companies, all the governments are trying to find some solutions, even with Paris Agreement, for example. It's really hard. We are proven that by the IPCC's reports, it's really hard to achieve 2 degrees C goals. So we need to address this issue. So when we look at the energy transition, so the main challenge we are seeing in the energy system is actually all the sectors in the energy sector, system are coming together. So we are seeing a convergence of different sectors. So previously we could have look at the power sector, industrial sector, residential sector, and transportation sector as separate energy sectors. And we could have looked at these sectors more in isolation. But now there are many connections. One of the major connections with power and transportation is from electrification of light-duty vehicles. So we are seeing many new vehicle models and approaches to have zero emissions from the vehicles, so on and so forth. Similarly, when we look at the industrial and transportation, hydrogen is tying these two sectors together. So if we want to decarbonize industry, electrifying is one approach, but probably it will not be enough. So we need hydrogen, and hydrogen can also be used for industry, so on and so forth. So there are many components there. And when we look at the residential sector with the rooftop solars, so on and so forth, now actually the residential sector is also part of the energy system, both as a producer and consumer. So everything is changing, and we need to take a systems approach to really understand and develop systems level insights about this transition. So to address this issue, in our group we are developing several models, and one of the models, it's a systems level technology assessment tool. Since our 2 goals are decarbonizing and meeting energy demand, so decarbonization is one of the main focuses. So what we have looked at is we take a life cycle assessment approach, and we've characterized the entire energy system into 6 vectors: upstream, midstream, processing, carbon capture, utilization and storage, gate to user, and end use. And these are basically life stages of any energy pathway, and we are including all the fossil resources, renewable resources, different processes to convert these resources into energy products, as well as all major sectors that use these energies. By doing so, we are taking a systems approach, and we are capturing all the relevant technological, operational, temporal and geospatial variabilities of the energy transition. And from now on, I will give you some examples of how we are using these kind of tools and some of the insights we are getting from actually running these simulations and optimization problems that we are defining. One starting example is from California. So over the last 7-8 years, we've seen a huge increase in solar generation in California. So the left bar shows for the month of May, generation in 2011 and 2017 from solar resources. In 2011, it was less than 1%, and in 2017, it's almost 20% of the generation in California. So this is a huge increase, and when we look at the thermal generation, and in California thermal generation is only natural gas, combined cycle units and gas turbine units, what we are observing is that there is a huge change in the profile of thermal generation. So the blue curve is 2011, it's more like a steady, almost like a base load generation. But in 2017, first of all, we are seeing a huge decrease during the daytime of the generation, and a super significant peak in the afternoon hours to basically balance the solar generation. So this is putting a lot of stress on the thermal generation units, but also it has emission consequences. So just to show you what kind of consequences we are expecting, so we've simulated some of these major combined cycle and gas turbine units. And here 100% loading to 40% loading are shown in blue and black. The first two bars are combined cycle units, and the others are different gas turbine units. They are very common in the US grid. So for combined cycle units, when you run these units 100% at their nameplate capacity, you are operating at their optimum configuration. So your emission profiles are quite low. So the life cycle emissions, including the upstream methane leakages, so on and so forth, is around 460 grams per kilowatt hour. But when you move to 40% loading, which is cycling down these units not to shut down, you are increasing the emissions by 15%. And for gas turbine units, this increases around 50%. So this is a huge extra emissions that is coming into the system. On the other hand, as I talked at the beginning, basically from solar also the emissions are not zero. And we really need to understand the emission sources, because we are manufacturing these units in China, we are shipping long distances, and we deploy with tracking or without tracking. So there is also emission consequences of using renewable power. Of course, these are much lower than fossil-based power, so I am not claiming natural gas will have lower emissions, but we need to understand that there is also an emission tag coming with these units. And so we are doing a parametric analysis to compare different locations, different options of tracking, efficiencies, so on and so forth, to really understand what is the impact of deploying different technologies of solar PV in different locations, and then see how much environmental benefits we can get out of this. So this graphs, actually, we've looked at different locations from US Southwest to India, China, Egypt, Colombia, Australia, different regions of the world which has different irradiance and solar solar potentials. And as you can see, so we are comparing here two technologies. One is multi-crystalline silicon, and the other one is cadmium telluride, mainly two of the most prominent PV technologies. And as you can see, when you deploy these two units at different locations, the environmental benefits varies quite a lot. And if we don't do these kind of detailed analysis based on locational value or locational capabilities of different resources, actually we can invest in wrong technologies. One of the another analysis we have done was on the tracking, for example. For some locations, adding one-axis tracking does not make any sense, because due to the additional emissions coming from building all these systems, balance of systems, so on and so forth, your emissions are much more than the gain that you will be getting from the one-axis or multi-axis tracking. But coming back to the main source of emissions, I want to come back to the question about California. So we've seen this huge increase from 1% to almost 20%. And when we look at the emissions from California, so here I show you the emissions from all thermal units in California from 2010 to 2018 on a monthly basis. And as you can see, in 2013 to 16, actually the emissions has not gone down. And in this period, we've seen this huge increase in solar. So the question is really what has happened. So we are investing on solar energy. We are converting our main source of power generation to renewables. But still, we are not seeing the emission reduction that we want to see. And even so, in 2018, so from 2011 to 18, this increase should be around 18% if it is linearly correlated with the solar generation, but it is not. So we really want to understand what is causing this. And so first of all, we looked at the more aggregate analysis. So we looked at all the units and then calculated annual capacity factors. So one observation is in the top bar, top row, where I'm showing you the combined cycle units annual capacity factors from 2010 to 16. The middle row is the open cycle gas turbine units. These are peaking units. And the bottom row is the steam turbines. So one observation that we get from here is actually for combined cycle units, as expected, capacity factors are going down, which means the base load is not provided as much from combined cycle as it was before. For open cycle gas turbine units, we are seeing an increase in the gas capacity factor, which means that we are using more of these gas turbine units to provide electricity. And when we compare the emissions intensity of combined cycle units and gas turbine units, it's almost double. So for the same amount of electricity, you are emitting almost twice as much when you generate from gas turbine units. So this is a huge increase. And what this is signaling is actually we need, if we want to totally decarbonize electric power system, we really need to deploy large amount of batteries or other energy storage options to get full benefit of switching to renewables. But actually, this kind of analysis is good, but not sufficient. So what we have done is we've collected the data of every generator in the US at hourly resolution for the last 17 years. And we looked at, not at the country or state level, but we looked at individual generator level. So this is showing an example load profile from one of the combined cycle units in California, which is shown here, the name. And you can see at every hour what was the loading from this unit, how much electricity is generated, what was the emissions, and how it is changing over time. So by doing this kind of analysis, we can really understand what has changed in the system, how renewables, penetration of renewables has changed the operation of existing units, and also we can come up with solutions to mitigate these some negative consequences of this change. And I will give you a couple of important observations about this before moving to carbon capture. Basically, what has happened is, first of all, now in California, we are shutting down combined cycle units and starting up again. So, which means that you are operating at more cold start combined cycle units, which increase your emission intensity. Secondly, now we are cycling these units up and down quite often. As I showed in the previous couple of slides, this is increasing your emission intensity. Also, the emission, the capacity factors on generation on combined cycle gas turbine units has increased quite a lot in this period of time, especially in the afternoon hours. This is also another reason why emission intensity is increasing in California's thermal generation. So now I want to move to another important topic, which is the rest of the world. So it's easy to blame any state about not doing so much, but actually when we look at the total globally, still almost 40% of total electricity generation is coming from coal. And as all of you know, coal power is much more dirtier than natural gas and definitely orders of magnitude higher than solar and wind power. But when we look at the global coal power capacity, and this big graph shows the global coal power plant capacity, more than 50% of the coal power plants are younger than 20 years. And depending on how you operate, the lifetime of a coal power plant is 40 to 60 years. So we are seeing a huge fleet in hand that will be around for a couple of decades. And when we look at the developing economies, or recently developed economies like China. So for China, more than 50% of the fleet is younger than 5 years old. So it's a very young power fleet. Nobody will retire these units before their lifetime. Similarly, in India, it is growing fast. And also these different colors show different technologies. Red is subcritical, blue is supercritical, and black is ultra supercritical. And when you move in this order, so you are basically, if it is red, you are emitting much more compared to ultra supercritical and supercritical. And even if you focus on the new generation units, which are less than 5 years old, most of the units are still the lowest quality that you can find, subcritical. So, just to give you an idea, so if instead of building 5 subcritical units, if you build 5 ultra supercritical unit, it is similar to deploying carbon capture to one of the subcritical units. So the emissions are quite high compared when you compare these two technologies. So the only option we can really decarbonize electricity generation globally is deploying carbon capture. So these units will be around, and we need carbon capture if we are really serious about decarbonizing global power sector. I don't want to depress you, but this is the current situation. So we are well behind what needs to be done. Currently, there are 32 million tons CO2 per year capture capacity globally, and this is approximately 17 global projects, large-scale projects. And total plant for 2025 is 74 million tons CO2 per year capacity. And let's look at the targets. So these are from different sources, IEA, EIA. Basically, the target is deploying 4 gigatons CO2 per year by 2040. And one missed target was 2.6 to 4.9 gigatons CO2 per year by 2020. This was with the EIA outlook, International Energy Outlook, in 2005. So what we expect to do is actually increase the capacity by 125 times in less than 20 years. And when we look at the last 20 years, really nothing has happened. And we are canceling the projects. We are not building new plants. There are only a couple of plants built. And this is quite a severe situation. And this shows the distribution of operational and total number of projects. And as you can see, many of the projects has been canceled over the years. And operational projects are mostly for natural gas processing. And when you extract natural gas, it comes with CO2, and actually to make valuable natural gas, you need to capture CO2, or you need to separate CO2 from natural gas. And these current deployments, most of them around 20 million tons per CO2 per year, is for natural gas processing. There are only 2 power plants. One is in Canada and the other one is in Texas. And these are the only deployed, currently deployed power plant projects, which totals around 2 million tons CO2 per year captured. So, and when we look at the distribution of today's capture technologies, it's 20 million tons is for natural gas processing, and these are the other ones are mainly demonstration projects. So there are one iron and steel project, one fertilizer production, and they are mostly in Canada and US. Also, the destination of CO2 is mostly enhanced oil recovery. So the CO2 is pressurized CO2 is pumped into the oil wells to get more oil, and depending on how much CO2 you put in, you can have a carbon benefit, but this is not like a 100% storage, because you are getting more oil, which are converted to gasoline or diesel, which is burned in cars, so that you are emitting CO2. One of the challenges of carbon capture is the cost of carbon capture. So it's quite expensive, and for depending on the technologies, and I'm showing you here an example from power plants, it's around $60 to $120 per megawatt hour in US context. So this is quite a burden for power plant operators, unless you have a carbon tax that will force these units to be done. On the CO2 utilization side, so there is a big buzz about CO2 utilization, and this can be good to really create value and to be able to start the acceleration of carbon capture. But in terms of climate change mitigation or carbon reduction, the scale is very low. So even if you convert all the today's CO2 to captured CO2, the total capacity you will be getting is around 300 million tons CO2 for all the products, including urea, methanol, and other carbonates. And if you also use captured carbon for CO2 enhanced oil recovery, it's an additional 100 million tons CO2 per year. And here, as you can see, today, even for EOR, most of the CO2 is coming from natural sources. So we are not using captured CO2 for enhanced oil recovery even today. So this is also showing one potential area of improvement, but not enough. And when we look at the power plant operations, so I am talking about deploying carbon capture for power plants. But as I've shown you in the previous slides about how combined cycle profiles are changing, we are seeing similar trends in coal power plants. And actually, with the lower capacity factors, it is really harder to explain the additional cost of carbon capture because they will be operated lower and lower with capacities, and their profiles are also challenging for capture processes. So when you look at the combined cycle units, which is at very high capacity factor on top, and more regular combined cycle units in the bottom, as you can see, if you deploy carbon capture to these power plants, they will be idle most of the time. Otherwise, they will do this cycling trend. So you need to go up and down in the capture process. And these capture processes are similar to other chemical processes. They are built to run at continuous level. And when you shift these operations to these kind of variability, it is really hard to use current technologies. So what can we do? So one area is that I am personally very interested is adding another energy vector to the energy system. So electricity is perfect for some sectors, but when we look at the emission decrease in the US over the last 17 years, as you can see, only electric power has decarbonized. So all the other sectors' emissions are either same or they are increased slightly. So if we want to decarbonize all the sectors, which is deep decarbonization, we need to have another energy vector, which can be hydrogen. And hydrogen is very flexible because you can produce from many resources. Currently, depending on where you are, it's mostly from natural gas or coal. But first of all, you can deploy carbon capture, which means you can decouple power generation from carbon capture. So you can capture CO2 continuously and then use hydrogen for your power generation. Secondly, you can use in all different sectors for transportation, electric power sector, industrial decarbonization, residential and commercial. And another important advantage of hydrogen is actually you can produce hydrogen from electricity and you can produce electricity from hydrogen. So they are interchangeable. Of course, you have an efficiency penalty, but at the end of the day, you can convert these two into each other. Just to give you an idea of how we can use hydrogen, how we can produce hydrogen and how we can use hydrogen. As you can see, so there are many ways of producing hydrogen, either with current processes, with natural gas reforming, with or without carbon capture, from power, from biomass, so on and so forth. And in all of these processes, there is one of the largest burden is on the infrastructure. So we need to build either pipelines or new processes, so on and so forth. But I just want to emphasize this as well. So when we electrify everything, the load on the utilities and grids will also be quite high. And we need to build new infrastructure for transmission lines and power generation as well. So the question here is where to invest. And having another energy vector will significantly increase your energy security. As well as you can, because of the flexibility of hydrogen, you can use in many other sectors and end users that are really hard to electrify. Before finishing up in the next couple of slides, I just want to also mention that all hydrogen has not been created equal. And Europeans like to label hydrogen in terms of green, blue, and brown hydrogen. Brown hydrogen is the hydrogen coming from fossil resources, either natural gas or coal, without carbon capture. Blue is with carbon capture, and green is coming from electricity that's produced from renewables, like if you have a wind turbine that supplies electricity to electrolyzer, then they call it green. And of course, emission intensities of each one of these are quite different. And when we talk about hydrogen, we cannot talk about one single hydrogen. We need to make sure that we know where it's coming from and what is the emission intensity of the hydrogen we are using for different sources. And as I mentioned before, so currently 48% of today's hydrogen production is natural gas based on steam methane reforming. 30% is oil and 18% is coal, and electrolytic hydrogen is only around 4%. And mostly today it is used for refining and chemicals industry. But it is not new. So we've been using hydrogen for a while. We know how to produce it, how to use it, how to transport it. And in the US, there are more than 1,600 miles of natural gas pipeline. Of course, this is much lower compared to natural gas pipelines, which is around 300,000 miles. But we know how to build these things. So that's promising. And also in terms of the light-duty vehicles. So currently there are around 39 hydrogen refueling stations in US, which is much lower than normal gas stations. And also looking at the global fuel cell electric vehicle fleet, US has the lead, around 5,000 vehicles, most of them are in California. And Japan has the highest number of fueling stations, around 100, with a fleet size of 2,500. So it is one of the technologies that's coming online, but probably for light-duty vehicles, it will be hard to show that hydrogen will play an important role, especially when we look at the current EV market and EV increase. Also, we need to look at the life cycle emissions. And here I will show you a graph of showing different emissions for same size vehicles having different powertrains, from internal combustion engines to hybrid electric vehicles to plug-in hybrid to battery electric vehicles charged with grid versus fuel cell electric vehicles. And everything is normalized to hybrid electric vehicles because this is considered as the standard moving forward as the most efficient option in the fleet. And if you use internal combustion engine, these numbers are for US, and it includes all life cycle stages, including the production of vehicles. So as you can see, for battery electric vehicles, the size of blue, which shows the vehicle production, is larger because you need to also manufacture batteries. Compared to hybrid electric vehicles, we emit approximately 40% more for internal combustion engine vehicles. We get similar emission profiles for plug-in hybrids. And BEVs has the lead for US average grid. And fuel cell electric vehicles, hydrogen coming from steam methane reforming without carbon capture, is also in the same range with the other options. And when we look at also the different hydrogen production methods over the next 20-30 years, if we use current grid with electrolysis, actually we emit more than the internal combustion engines. But when we move to cleaner production methods like steam methane reforming with carbon capture, or fuel cell electric vehicles with electrolysis with wind power, actually we can quite a bit decrease the overall emissions from hydrogen vehicles. And also, when we think about hydrogen vehicles, we really need to keep this in mind, and the source of hydrogen will have an important role in the overall emissions. Finally, it's basically, as I mentioned, we need to decouple power system from carbon capture, and hydrogen can play an important role here. We can have central facilities that converts natural gas to hydrogen with carbon capture, and you can use hydrogen in power plants to deal with these kind of profiles. Before finishing up, my final point is we can really use hydrogen as an energy vector, but when we look at the current production capacity in the US, it's around 10 million tons per year. which is equivalent of 1.2 exajoules energy equivalency. And US total energy use is around 107 exajoules. So to have a meaningful role for hydrogen, we really need to scale up the production infrastructure and everything. But hydrogen can really play a role in all of these sectors, and it can help deep decarbonization efforts. So I will stop here. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer your questions after the panel.
I think everybody can hear me. I'll just talk loud and try to put this on. Thank you very much. That was fantastic. And I've got lots of ideas and questions, but before I say anything like that, I'll turn it over to Budak Bey to provide his analysis.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Can you hear me? Sesim duyuluyor mu arkadan? On. On. Well, first of all, I want to thank Emre for this presentation, very interesting presentation. I will not talk about every aspects, every subject of this paper, but rather I will try to be general and talk about the total energy, total impact of energy transition as a whole. We have seen a few examples towards to reach the ambitious climate target, which is 2 degrees, which is not very easily achievable, as Emre says, and to reach a carbon-free energy system. There is an ongoing effort in every country, in every facility, in every institute. What we have listened today are some of the examples of this tremendous efforts to reach it. Of course, energy transition will not happen in 1 day or 1 year, as some people dreaming. It will take time. We will need transitional measures, such as how to keep the existing thermal fleet for the safety of system, for the baseload generation, for reliability of our power system. So we should do something to keep them alive in this transitional phase. Of course, this transition towards a clean energy world needs innovative approaches. We have seen some of them. Although some of them are not feasible at the moment, some of them are only at childhood stage. It will happen eventually, but it will have costs. It will have other impacts. For example, Californian example, the thermal power plant capacity factors reduced drastically. It was expected that the emissions will reduce as well, but as Emre says, it is not reduced as expected. But it is not the only impact. There is a commercial impact of this energy transition. The reduced capacity factors of the gas plants and coal plants is making impossible to operate those plants in a market, in a competitive market, because of the high cost, because of the lower efficiency of, because of the lower capacity factors. So one impact is the only impact is not emissions, but there are other impacts. For Turkey, for example, it has a different meaning. If those low capacity factors, because of this renewable penetration, will continue, there will be no investment for the base load generation because of this commercial aspect of this transition. Also, from the power sector perspective, renewables are the most important mean to reach the carbon-free energy world, energy target. However, it needs other innovative approaches, such as more flexible power system, transmission system operation, more smart grids. By the way, I don't like to say smart grids, I just want to say smarter grids, because grids, I'm an old transmission operator, grids were always smart to some degree. Now, it is not a new thing to have a smart grid. It will be smarter though. So grid operation will change. Not only system operation, but the market operation will change. There will be thousands, hundreds of thousands of prosumers in the field. The market rules, classical market rules, wholesale markets, contracts, etc., will have to change. The new regulations will be issued, have to be implemented. Not only the system operation or technology. Every technology, every innovation in this field will be disruptive. What I mean disruptive, it will alter the methods, the way of operating the markets, way of operating the systems. So this disruption will have a cost, of course. When we mention about an energy system, we always classically say that it should be sustainable development. That is the supply security, environmental sustainability, and affordability. This change, this transition should be designed and implemented so that it should be sustainable, because it will have cost, and that cost should be affordable. Now, in household tariff in Turkish citizens at the moment, which is not we are far away from our renewable targets, but half of the energy cost of Turkish consumers are coming for paying the cost of the renewables, renewable support mechanism. So this transition will happen, such technological innovations will happen, but it will take time, and it should be planned and implemented very carefully. Otherwise, the sustainable, if you stretch one edge of the triangle of the sustainability, this system will not be sustainable, and the eventual aim cannot be reached.
Thank you. Okay. Professor De Figlio, thank you very much, first of all, for the kind invitation. This was an excellent presentation, I think, which has elaborated on the two breakthrough technologies, to say so, on the road to decarbonizing the global energy system. And I will echo or second some of the words of Mr. Dilli in my intervention. I have to say that these two technologies are not really the core work of Shura. However, I have studied before I came here to be able to reflect on this very interesting paper. But first of all, I think I want to put a bit more perspective on this decarbonization issue, because I fear that we've missed this week's events in New York at the UN headquarters. As you may have been following, especially at different ages of the society, are screaming at the decarbonizing of the energy sector. The Swedish activists you heard, but also the politicians have been discussing this at the start of this week. And the UN Secretary General actually has highlighted 6 key areas on decarbonizing the global economy, and 2 of them were on energy and industry sector. So these are the 2 technologies which you touched upon, and I think they are indeed the core areas, because the energy sector is accounting for 2/3 of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So if we change this, then we are on the way to decarbonizing the economy. However, the challenge is significant, as we all said, but I want to put a few number tags there. First of all, the average increase in the global temperature is around 0.05 degrees per year. So that means in the next, say, 10 years or so, we will be achieving the 1.5 degree limit. So that's the very ambitious, or the role model target of the Paris Climate Agreement. Otherwise, say in 20 years or so, the 2 degree target will be reached. So that's sort of the general definition of the Paris Climate Agreement. But in both areas, there's a huge risk, as we foresee, in whether we will be able to reach these targets or not. And if you look at the breakdown of the CO2 emissions, obviously power sector is a very important one, because it represents 40% of the total global CO2 emissions, but the 60% is where the actual challenge lies, and our colleague has highlighted that very nicely. That's in the end-use sector, so industry, the manufacturing industry, transport sector, and the buildings. The transport and the industry are the largest. Buildings is relatively small, but it's not negligible. Now, I want to put my words on these 2 technologies by looking into 2 major global energy transformation scenarios carried out by 2 intergovernmental organizations. One of them is the IEA, the International Energy Agency, which obviously the ICAC also has very close working relations with, and the other one is the IRENA, International Renewable Energy Agency, where I have spent nearly 5 years in my previous career. At the IEA, which is producing every year the most authoritative global energy scenarios in its World Energy Outlook, has a new scenario data set called the Sustainable Development Scenario. And if you look into that, and the Sustainable Development Scenario is in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, and if you look into the technology breakdown there, what you see for the CCS, so carbon capture and sequestration and use, a total potential of 15% of the total technology breakdown. So of all the emissions reductions we need to achieve, 15% would come from the CCS technology. And if you put that in volume of megatons, that's 2.3 gigatons of CO2 being captured. Our colleague has shown also similar numbers. And I think this was very interesting, because if you look at the level today, we are only having a total capacity in operation of 30 megatons from less than 20 projects for carbon capture and storage and utilization. So it's an effort of 80 times growth if you want to achieve this scenario. And if you want to compare the total amount to be captured, that's around 6 to 7 times of all the CO2 emissions Turkey is emitting at the moment. Just to put that in perspective. Now, it's a very nice, obviously, technology. It's a technology which has been discussed for nearly 2 decades. Where is this happening at the moment, this technology? It's mainly in the oil and gas sector, in the enhanced oil recovery. I think we've seen the demonstration projects, or the ones in operation in the previous presentation. But where it should actually be applied, as our colleague has highlighted, it's the power sector. So that's one of them. And the other one is the industry sector, the manufacturing industry. But at the moment, there is only one CCS in the world, in Abu Dhabi, in the iron and steel sector, a few for fertilizer, and for the power sector, we have 2 examples. So where we should be focusing on, we are missing the technology deployment at the moment. So it's a big challenge. When you look at what do you do with that carbon you captured, are you going to sequester it? Are you going to use it? That's the other question. And the sequestration is a more geological problem, which depends on the territory of each country. For instance, where would you sequester CO2 in Turkey? And if you want to use the CO2, you will either need a readily available industry to utilize that CO2, or you will need to invest in infrastructure to be able to transport that CO2 to another place where it can be utilized. So these are investment-related questions which needs to be answered. A more practical thing to highlight on the carbon capture, which is some experience from the industry sector, is the need for process modification. On paper, on models, it looks very nice that the CO2 comes from the flue gas and you can immediately capture it, or it's even in pure forms, like in fertilizer sector or some iron processes. But it's not necessarily that the technology or the engineering does not necessarily allow that you retrofit or integrate the capture unit on top of the plant. So these type of trade-offs or limitations also need to be taken into account in such planning exercises. Another issue, which is perhaps minor, it's been improving over the past years, is carbon capture requires energy to capture for absorption process, for the chemicals, but also for the compression process, because you need to compress that CO2 to a certain level of bar, and that also eats up from your energy, from your power plant efficiency. So you would need to account for that also. And before I came here, I looked at the recent numbers of what are the actual capture rates in these two power plants, one in the which we've seen in the presentation. Ideally, you would like to go to 80–90% capture rates, with 10 to 20% being not being able to capture it. But the reality is the Petronova project in the US captures just over a third of the flue gas from one of the 4 coal-fired power units. And the plant and boundary dam project, which is in Canada, is actually capturing only 31%. So there's room for improvement there also. And finally, I think we've seen successful examples of the enhanced oil recovery. So that's a way to use that CO2. And the injected CO2 in the field needs to be retained, not leaked. And at the moment, there is no project in operation that there is such leakage. But in the future, as capacity increases, this needs to be taken into account. And also this type of what is the real capture rates needs to be learned. So there's some also framework in terms of monitoring, reporting, verification will be needed as we go along with the CCS route. So I will sum up here for the CCS or the carbon capture and CCS and CCU part before I switch to some thoughts on hydrogen. Obviously, carbon capture is essential for the fossil fuel industry and for manufacturing industries, also a way to avoid stranded assets in the future with very ambitious climate policies. However, unfortunately, we are far from deployment, but what can we do? I'll try to touch a little bit upon that before I switch to the hydrogen part. And that I will try to build that argument based on the recent scenarios of the International Renewable Energy Agency, which is an intergovernmental organization which Turkey is also part of. And they release their scenarios every year in April. So in their technology mix, they assume or they estimate of all the total CO2 emission reductions to be achieved by 2050 in line with the Paris Agreement, 40% to come from renewables, 40% efficiency, 15% electrification, like electric vehicles or electrified heating, and 5% other technologies, which includes CCS. And I find this a very interesting mix, especially because of the trends we see in the power sector, very successful trends, where we see a lot of wind and solar being able to be accommodated by different countries' energy mixes. So you see easily with the current grid, which is, as we heard, smart in various countries, 25%, 30% is possible. Obviously, depends on the country. And as you go along, you will need more flexibility there to be able to accommodate these wind and solar. But these technologies are available, and most of the times it's not only technology. by simple market design, by investing anyway, which you would do in your grid capacity, by making that more renewable friendly, and stronger grids is a way to integrate more renewables. And then the question, which I just mentioned at the very beginning of my intervention, is what do you do with the end-use sectors, transport, heating, in buildings and industry, and also growing demand for cooling. Obviously, renewables have a large potential there, and hydrogen is one of them, and electrification, electric vehicles, etc., is another. But I will try to touch upon a little bit the missing link, which is the hydrogen in this equation. As we heard, majority of the hydrogen is produced, 95% actually is from fossil fuels, and much of that is from steam reforming of methane. Only China and Australia uses oil and coal gasification at the moment. And what's interesting is actually the current portfolio of hydrogen use can be quite a bit diversified. First of all, you can simply inject the hydrogen into the existing gas pipelines to use it for heating. So that's sort of an easy way out, maybe. You can produce electricity, that's what we heard. You can use it as a feedstock for chemicals production, and from that you can produce fertilizer. You can produce methanol, which is a transport fuel actually, or you can use it as a fuel cell for cars. And if you look at the current trend, there are two major hydrogen trends which are picking up. One of them is fuel cells in Japan. Majority. California is doing some stuff there, and a few European countries look into the options. And another one, which I will elaborate further in the next couple of minutes, is the renewable electricity-based hydrogen. So there are two nice things happening there. One of them is the renewable electricity is becoming more and more cheaper, but also the electrolysis process to produce hydrogen, which is an electricity-based process, is also becoming cheaper. The alkaline electrolysis process is the cheapest one, which is commonly used at the moment, but there are two alternatives, which is one of them is the polymer electrolyte-based, and the other one is solid oxide. The PEM process is the one which you may have most heard of. It is becoming cheaper, and in the next 30 years, projections show that its capacity or capex, which is at the moment around $850 per kilowatt, will be held in the next 20, 30 years or so. So there's a big potential there. Renewables are cheaper, hydrogen costs are becoming cheaper, and that can be used for all different applications, but it's not as easy as it looks like, because there are a few bottlenecks there, which very briefly I will talk about. First of all, you need large-scale demand for that hydrogen. To create this cost reductions, there needs to be economies of scale. Another one is the infrastructure. I think we heard that very nice in the previous presentation. There are different ways. The advantage is that the current hydrogen system offers a large distribution network which can be built upon and can be expanded. There are some ideas of how to refurbish the natural gas pipelines to be able to mix that with hydrogen, or you will need new infrastructure, which is new investment. And another thing is a more strategical choice, especially in the transport sector. Are you going to go to electric vehicles, which has its own infrastructure question, or are you going to go to hydrogen-based transport sector? That's a different infrastructure. So there is this trade-off which needs to be decided by country, perhaps. And a final thing on the hydrogen part is its supply cost. Compared to the gas supply cost, hydrogen cost is 2 to 5 times higher at the moment. And the way to reduce that is to avoid losses in production, conversion, and transportation of hydrogen. So these need to go down significantly if you want to have reach a break-even point. So I talked a lot about technology. But I think Mr. Dilli has very nicely put in words that this is not only technology. It actually goes beyond that. And there are simpler ways of accelerating this energy transition. We've talked about market design, but not only innovation in technology, but also innovation in financing models and in policy models are equally important as much as the innovation in technology. And perhaps I will stop here. And one last word is both these technologies are essential. They are important that we start researching on these, but they won't offer the panacea for an entire energy transition. They are complementary to the first efficiency, and then renewables, and then electrification. So, thank you.
Thank you. I think where we are right now, I think it's a good time to open it up for questions, especially any questions about our presentation. I'll start out by asking about this problem of variable production or load following production, and in terms of separating the hydrogen from a fossil fuel and then using carbon capture. And you mentioned before the problem of having a steady state flow of carbon in order to do the sequestration. So how much of a buffer storage capacity do you have to have for the hydrogen to make that work? How much capacity do you have to have in hydrogen storage to make a system like that work? Have you looked at that?
Yeah, actually, we are currently looking at the economics of this problem, and so. To be honest, you don't need to have a lot of hydrogen storage, because the idea here is that you will produce hydrogen centralized and you will feed that hydrogen into many other sectors. And I haven't mentioned, but just to also touch upon one of the points. So hydrogen can be used for light duty vehicles, but I think the entry point to the transportation sector is for heavy duty vehicles, where you need a higher density energy carriers, or it will be used in production of fuels. And so hydrogen has many different sources, different end users that you can basically supply to. And in a centralized facility, you will be producing hydrogen from natural gas reforming, and this will run pretty much continuously. And with current steam methane reforming units are operating around 85% throughout the year. 84% of the hours, it's around 8,000 hours. And I think you will have the similar capacities, and you can have some on-site storage in case you have a distribution problem for power plants or for industrial facilities. But also, as in the natural gas pipelines also provide some storage capacity. You can increase the pressure of pipelines, and then you can store some capacity of hydrogen in the pipelines as well. So that's also another way of solving this problem. But in terms of carbon capture, these plants are mostly amine-based, absorption-based processes. And the main advantage will be to capture the CO2, because you will run the continuously hydrogen production, and you can continuously produce CO2, capture CO2. And if you are using steam methane reforming, you have two sources of CO2. One is from the reforming unit, and the other one is from combustion. And another process is called autothermal reforming. And if you are using autothermal reforming, it's easier to capture. Then you only have access to one CO2 source, then you can easily capture up to 90%. But basically, you will be able to capture CO2 continuously, and also you don't need to transport CO2 to different storage sites. Otherwise, if you want to decarbonize 8 to 12 power plants, this is the calculation that we've recently done, you need to deploy 8 to 12 carbon capture facilities if they are deployed in the power plant. But you can provide the same amount of hydrogen that will supply to these 12 units of power plant by only one steam methane reforming, which means you don't need to transport CO2 to the storage site from all different 12 generation units. Plus, you will have the advantage of running these units continuously, which will significantly reduce the economics of capturing.
Thank you. First, I'll also give the opportunity for any questions here before I turn it over to the audience. Any questions? Okay. Then who has a question? Okay, right over here.
You know, when we look at the conclusions here, you say CCUS is essential for deep decarbonization. You mentioned in your presentation that it is very costly process, very costly technology. And Dr. Saygın also mentioned in his speech, you also use a lot of efficiency. Mm-hmm. So I will go on this efficiency issue. You put a slide showing the carbon coal power plant fleet in world, China and India. Yep. So as you can see, let's say you have ultra supercritical power plant, the efficiency will be, let's say, 43–44%, and subcritical, let's say, 35%. With CCS, you lose about 9 to 10% efficiency. So therefore, ultra supercritical power plant becomes even below subcritical power plant, and subcritical power plant efficiency will be less than 30%. So therefore, my question is, do you still, let's say, defend CCS?
Yeah. So I think that's a great point, but the efficiency loss is around 5% absolute, so 10% of the total generation will reduce, but the efficiency will be from 43% to 38%, and for subcritical from 33 to 28%. So it's a penalty that we need to pay. But actually, to the point of the panelists, so when we talk about Petronova and boundary dam processes, so when you look at the overall power plant, they are capturing 1/3 of the CO2, but actually what they have done is they have only converted one unit in the power plant, and they are capturing 90% of the CO2 from that flue gas. And in Petronova, they are using a very different approach, exactly to address your point, to supply the energy for the carbon capture processes. They have built a new combined cycle unit, and they use the combined cycle unit for providing steam to the carbon capture process in the coal power plant. So the overall efficiency penalty is lower because combined cycle is much more efficient than coal power plant. But of course, there will be always a penalty, and also there will be a cost. But if we want to decarbonize, and if we want to keep existing plants, this is what we need to do.
I think Mr. Dilli has a comment.
Well, we are mentioning about the lower capacity factors due to generation from renewables. And we see the examples, even in Turkey, we see the same examples. So the carbon capture has a cost. It is already costly. Will it be possible to implement it with 25% capacity factor, for example? Because the cost of the generation will increase too much.
Yeah.
I think it is that alternative of implementing carbon capture and storage in power plants is a good dream, but only dream. Do you share this?
So currently it looks like a dream when we look at the targets and where we are actually. But if you will be deploying carbon capture, it will be only for the base load generation, which is running more than 85% capacity factor. But for China fleet, they don't see this yet. But if they will see the same trends, then actually my personal opinion is to switch to hydrogen for some of these units. Instead of running on natural gas, let's produce hydrogen in a centralized facility that we can use for different sectors, different end users, and also convert some of these units into hydrogen. And this is actually one of the, there's one project from Equinor. They are converting combined cycle, 3 combined cycle units in Netherlands to hydrogen. And this is an ongoing project. And for CO2, Europe is very sensitive to sequester CO2 in the European mainland. So they are planning to ship it to Norway offshore and then sequester CO2 there. So that's an ongoing project.
I guess what you're basically assuming is that renewables have storage, so that the impact on renewables is no longer variable and no longer forces the baseload plants into load following. Is that a reasonable way of putting it?
So I think that's a reasonable point, but I think we still need another option in the system. Because there is also season-to-season variation as well as year-to-year variation. Especially we are seeing this in power sectors where hydro is very high. And if in case of a drought, the generation from hydro is very low, which means you need to have a backup plan. And with batteries, it's really hard to have that much of backup. So we are talking about gigawatt-hour scales. To some extent, we can do it, but you need to have a molecule in the system, either hydrogen or natural gas, to be able to generate electricity once we have these kind of natural situations.
Okay. Questions? Yeah, please.
Well, I think you posed that hydrogen has the potential, and it is a promising energy form, and that's great. But as you didn't say it, but I gather that it is the process in hydrogen is more of an evolutionary, and a lot of innovation is being done. We need to be a bit more patient about it, because it depends on a lot of other things to get to the efficiency so that it can compete with others. While this is happening, I think it has been questioned and asked, carbon capture, with the way that you posed, China, India, and in fact US as well, is that most of the power plants, using coal. So 10 years ago, I did a great deal of work and looked at strictly for business purposes as a line of services for the carbon sequestration. And we elected not to pursue because the commerciality wasn't there. It's been 10 years, and at the moment, my question to you is that what do you think, the carbon capture and storage state of the art technology, and is it cheap enough? Is it enough R&D being done for this area so that actually policymakers elect to do this? Unless it is cheaper, China isn't going to use it, and neither US or President Trump. So what do you think? Enough research is being done on carbon capture? Because that's a major obstacle, and if that can be answered, a huge amount of CO2 can be captured relatively easily. If you were to capture 75% of it, huge, impact, right?
Yeah. So unfortunately, the short answer is no. Currently, the base technology is amine-based, and there are a couple of commercial processes, but they basically do amine-based absorption. There are potential membrane-based processes and others, but I haven't shown, but we also looked at the evolution of publications in this domain. And we saw the same trend from 2013 to today. Actually, the number of publications are decreasing. So there is not enough research in this area, and also there is not enough funding for research, and that's one of the main problems. And today, in all the 17 large-scale projects, we are using the same technology, very expensive, very capital expensive, big industrial processes. So I think we need modular and also high efficiency processes, but also there are efforts from companies and also especially oil and gas companies. One example is using fuel cells, carbonate fuel cells in conjunction with combined cycle units that can do carbon capture. Another one is Alum Cycle. So it's a company called Net Power in Texas. So they are building this supercritical CO2-based power generation, which has CO2 as the working fluid, so you can easily capture CO2. And also in my group, we are working on developing some CO2 capture processes for natural gas plants. So my background is chemical engineer. I am very interested in process development as well. So we are also trying to find conceptually new processes that can capture CO2. But that's a great point. I don't think there is enough research in this space.
Please.
Thank you for your all comments. I just would like to ask a question regarding the transition of energy. You said there is two legs. The first one is the increase of the CO2, which we are talked a lot in order to reduce it. How we can do it by the technologies and also the regulations or the market conditions. But what about the demand side? I mean, in order with the efficiency or the demand side management, do you believe that we are giving enough funds or enough effort to manage that side of the picture?
So I think that's another great point. So I think there is much ongoing on the demand side management and shifting the load, going to smarter grids, especially in terms of electric vehicles and charging. There are many works looking at how we can use this charging basically to balance the load so that you will not have these peaks that you need to supply with either energy storage or peaking plant, but use EVs charging to have more like a stable grid. So I am not an expert in that area, but as far as I can see in our electric power system work, so there is a big interest in this topic, as well as there are innovations in the community about that.
I have two questions. One is about the production of hydrogen. That is, does it work? Yeah, okay. I have only read here that you intend to produce, or someone intend to produce hydrogen from coal gasification, which is the GHGs, greenhouse gases are 4 times more than producing it by electrolysis. Actually, gasification is accounted to be an hydrogen producing technology because you produce syngas, mainly carbon monoxide, hydrogen and elemental nitrogen. So you can easily capture hydrogen from gasification, not maybe from coal, but you can use any hydrocarbon like waste, which is a headache. The second question I have is that carbon dioxide is a big problem, especially for the combustion technologies. So since you're a chemical engineer, you declared, why don't we use Budak reaction to produce 2 moles of carbon monoxide by using carbon dioxide? Thank you.
So for the first point about coal gasification, so currently China and Australia are using coal gasification to produce hydrogen. So, and I don't think this is, of course, this is not the best way of producing hydrogen, especially if you are not capturing CO2, but this is happening today. And I am not necessarily saying that we need to do that, but this is the reality. But if we are planning to use these technologies in the future, we definitely need carbon capture. Otherwise, it will be dirtier than using other options. And for the CO2 conversion, there are many ways of converting CO2, and also you can produce methanol from CO2, or you can use to produce algae, other chemical processes. There are processes looking at how you can convert CO2 to methane, so on and so forth. At the end of the day, it is all about the cost and efficiency. And since CO2 has no energy value, so whenever you want to convert CO2 into something else, you need to put in energy, and the penalty is quite high. But currently, there are many groups looking at electrochemical conversion of CO2, in which case you can use renewable electricity to drive these reactions to produce chemicals. And producing fuel is one option, but of course it is not valuable product once you produce methanol or methane. So currently what most of the research is focusing is producing more valuable, high value products. And so I am not working in this topic, but there are many groups working on this. Especially in Europe, there is a big push on CO2 utilization. And I don't necessarily agree with their approach, because they want to promote this as a CO2 reduction and overall decarbonization pathway. And this depends about how you use the molecule. For example, you can use CO2 in concrete manufacturing, then it's kind of a storage mechanism. But if you are producing fuel or any other molecule that will eventually be combusted, actually you are just delaying the emission of CO2. So we need to be very careful about time frame of when we are converting something into something else and how we are using it.
Thank you very much for this presentation. There are a lot of questions regarding the CCS, CCU, but I want to touch upon some other stuffs. As you know that we are going too close to the deadline for the, let's say, for cutting our emissions. Do you think that we should focus our effort to be more on the successful project? For instance, they are saying that, okay, let's use hydrogen in the LDVs, light duty vehicles. But as you know, water vapor is produced by the LDVs, and water vapor is also a greenhouse gas. And okay, the GWP has yet to be calculated, but still, especially in the urban area, it can create a different climate. So that saying, having said that, would you think that shall we invest on the hydrogen to be used in the aviation, since it has a higher calorific value, so it can save, let's say, fuel and more it is centralized. So we have like, let's say, handful of companies that producing. So what's your take?
So starting from the last point about aviation, I think it's very risky to use hydrogen in aviation. Plus, the volumetric energy density of hydrogen is very low. So in terms of the amount of hydrogen you need to put, either you need to pressurize to very high pressure or you need to liquefy to be able to use in aviation. But you can also use hydrogen, and you need hydrogen for biofuel production. And my way of thinking is, I think for aviation, biofuels is the way to go. And I think we can handle that much CO2 emissions for security. For the your other points, so I don't think we should pick winners. And if from my presentation it was CCUS and hydrogen, I didn't mean to give that message. I think we need a portfolio of solutions. So, and I am totally open of very optimistic solutions such as direct air capture or other solutions converting CO2 into use other molecules. So I think we need a portfolio of options, many options that will fit into different pieces in different energy systems. And also one of the points I want to make is there is no single solution that will work everywhere. Turkey is different from USA. Every state of USA is different. So the technology mix that will bring us to this decarbonization targets will be very different for different regions. And one of the slides actually I took off from here is I was looking at the entry point of hydrogen in the US. And if you're thinking about New England area, Boston, New York, probably for residential heating or heating, hydrogen will make sense because we have so horrible winters. The temperatures goes to -30°C and heat pumps are not efficient at that low temperatures. But if you think about California, it doesn't make sense to use hydrogen for residential heating, but for heavy duty vehicles or refineries, it will have a role. So I think if it's not clear, we should definitely look into regional resource availability and end users and develop regional portfolios. And one of the key areas of energy transition is actually decentralized production and distributed production. So this is key because the solution for everywhere is different and we need to have all these tools in our toolbox.
But just if I may just chime in on the use of the hydrogen, which is happening at the moment in terms of promising pathways, is one of them, or actually there are two plants which are investigating and close to commercial operation are in Europe to produce green steel, to say so, from renewables-based hydrogen. And the costs of those production routes are, say, coming close to a break-even point with the steel produced from coal. And one other route which is being investigated at the moment is, instead of transporting hydrogen over long distances, is producing hydrogen and producing other goods on site, and then transporting those goods, which are more high value added or even easier. And one route which is being currently investigated is in Australia. Instead of Australia exporting iron ore to Asia, producing iron from direct reduced iron route from renewable hydrogen and exporting iron, the pig iron itself, or even the steel itself. So these type of also options are being investigated, which can make hydrogen in the shorter term more cost effective and create an initial market. So just wanted to add that also.
Great point.
Thank you, Professor De Filio, my dear friend, for having organized this session. It's quite timely, and especially at a time when climate change is high on the international agenda and in New York with the summit. Thank you, Mr. Gençer. This energy transition is a process. It will take time. It's encouraging and comforting to hear you talking about new technologies that the international community, especially the US, United States and California, that you are trying to develop new technologies. But I'm not that optimistic about the process, because if you look to the east and see that India and Indonesia and China are heavily investing still. They have young generation, maybe coal-fired power plants, but they are still heavily investing in coal. And there is no will whatsoever on their part to switch to other energy resources. Maybe China, they're trying to prevent pollution and trying to switch to renewables. But still, if you see their capacity, it's highly unlikely that by 2050 can we reach the set targets. It's because we set very ambitious targets. The targets are very ambitious. But probably it will take time. It will take time, and unfortunately, there is no political will also on the part of the U.S. Administration and the rulers and many other rulers to take more commitments. So maybe we will talk about not zero carbon economies, but decarbonization, or maybe efforts towards lower carbon economies. Thank you.
So, thank you for your comments. I totally agree. And actually, I wanted to also show all of you this in the graph about the hydrogen, because even with current status, we are seeing decarbonization in only power sector, and all the other sectors are remaining. So I am also not optimistic, but I think we need to work on this, and we need to raise awareness about this project, and we need to work very hard. We need to invest on new technologies, both on research as well as starting some of these pilot plants to make sure that we have the technology once we really need it.
We have time for one more question. Over here.
Thank you very much for this very interesting topic and very fruitful discussions. Very hot topic of the recent era is being discussed. You were talking about generation of hydrogen from different sources. Would you consider different sources as having different chances of success in the future? And my question leads to the fact that some upstream natural gas and oil companies have quite large vested interest in bringing up those sources to economic use. Would it be, do you think, would it be possible to make the hydrogen transition more successful if those companies are, or if those income streams are included? That is to say, generation of hydrogen from natural gas? Would that be more? Would that make it more possible for success? Thank you.
So, thank you very much for the question. So, I think that's another great point. So, definitely. So, coming back to the regional solution key area. So, I think for US, natural gas in the midterm will definitely be the main source for hydrogen production. Natural gas is now so cheap that there is no way other hydrogen production processes can compete. Just to give you an idea, you can produce natural gas based hydrogen without carbon capture is around $1 per kilogram. With carbon capture it's around $1.5 to $2 per kilogram. And when you compare with current electrolysis using grid electricity, which has CO2 emissions, which is around 450 grams CO2 per kilowatt hour, the minimum cost you will get is around $4.5 to $5. And this is an optimistic number. So in the US context, there is no way you can compete with other technologies with natural gas-based hydrogen production. But this is different for Europe and other parts of the world, because in other parts of the world, in Europe, you don't have access to cheap natural gas. Also, electricity is much more expensive. So basically, we need to optimize these systems for different regions. And we will come up with the best solutions that will drive the infrastructure investments first. Thank you.
Let me please ask everybody to thank our three speakers for such a great job. Thank you.
Çok teşekkürler. Sağ olun.